Hey there, guys. Tonight, I want you to get comfortable, real comfortable. Wrap yourself in your favorite blanket, maybe play a soft fan in the background, or crack open a window just a bit to let in the cool night air. Now take a deep breath. Let's slow everything down, because tonight, we're stepping into a moment in history that most people have never heard about. And yet, it touched nearly every corner of the world. A time when summer never came, when crops withered in the fields, when snow fell in June and rivers froze in August, a year when the sky itself turned on humanity. This is the story of the year without a summer, a year so cold, so strange and so silent that it broke the rhythm of life across continents. And through it all, ordinary people, farmers, mothers, children, travelers, struggled to survive in a world that seemed to have stopped working. Before we dive deep, take a second to let me know where you're listening from in the comments. What time is it for you? Midnight? 2 a.m.? Early morning, maybe? It's always a strange and beautiful thing, knowing someone across the world is hearing this story at the same time, wrapped in their own quiet. And if you find yourself enjoying this slow descent into history, go ahead and like the video. Subscribe if you want more like this, but only if it genuinely brings you a little peace. This is not a loud story. There's no war here, no kings or grand battles, just cold wind, gray skies, empty fields, and people who didn't give up. Let's begin. Imagine this. You wake up in mid-June. You expect warmth, sun, birdsong, maybe a day in the fields. But instead, frost has dusted your window. The air is bitter, your breath puffs like smoke, and your children are still asleep, curled together for warmth like puppies. Outside, the soil is hard, like late winter, and the leaves are trembling in a wind that shouldn't even be here. And the worst part? You don't know why. There's no news. No scientific explanation, no radio, no alerts, no global warnings, just a creeping dread that something is deeply wrong. And maybe it isn't going away anytime soon. This isn't the Middle Ages. It isn't prehistoric time. This is 1816. You, your neighbors, and entire countries are about to live through a year where nothing behaves as it should. And yet, somehow, you must still eat, still protect your family, still carry on. So tonight, we're going to explore how people from all over the world, from quiet villages in New England, to mountain farms in Switzerland, to rice paddies in southern China, managed to survive the year the sun forgot to rise. They didn't know they were part of a global disaster. They just endured. We'll walk with them, feel what they felt, and hopefully find a little of their quiet strength as we drift off into this frozen story together. So, are you ready? Let's go back to 1815, and the day the world began to change. It didn't begin with frost, or famine, or silence. It began with fire. Thousands of miles from the quiet villages of Europe, the forests of New England, and the rice paddies of Asia, something ancient stirred beneath the earth. Far away, in the Dutch East Indies, what we now call Indonesia, a mountain rumbled, Mount Tambora, a stratovolcano, tall and sharp, rising high above the island of Sumbawa. It had been quiet for centuries, sleepy, almost forgotten. But in April of 1815, the sky cracked open. The eruption of Mount Tambora wasn't just an explosion. It was the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history, larger than Krakatoa, more violent than Vesuvius. It was a cataclysm so massive, so far-reaching, that it would affect the very climate of the Earth. And no one outside the island even knew it had happened. Not right away. In the villages closest to the mountain, the sky turned black. Entire towns disappeared in seconds, swallowed by fire and ash. The roar could be heard nearly 2,000 kilometers away. That's like hearing thunder from a storm happening in a different country. But it wasn't the fire or the lava that doomed the world. It was the ash. Mount Tambora launched over 160 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. Dust, ash, sulfur dioxide, particles so fine they didn't fall back to Earth. Instead, they climbed up into the stratosphere, high above the clouds, where winds are silent and movement is slow. And then, like a ghostly blanket, the ash began to wrap around the globe. A volcanic veil. You couldn't see it from the ground, but over the months that followed, the planet began to change. The sunlight grew dimmer, the days a little cooler and then colder. The skies, strange, painted with odd colors, crimson sunsets, unsettling halos around the moon. Poets and painters of the time wrote about this haunting light, not knowing they were watching particles of ash scattered across the sky. In London, the artist William Turner captured glowing reds and eerie yellow skies in his paintings. In Switzerland, a group of writers, including Mary Shelley and Lord Byron, sat by a fire one stormy night, watching the strange weather. That same night, Frankenstein was born, because the world was no longer the same. This wasn't weather, it was climate collapse. They didn't have that word back then. To them, it just felt like a bad year. But beneath their feet, something bigger was unraveling. The ash acted like a mirror, bouncing sunlight back into space. Temperatures across the globe began to drop. Rain patterns shifted, growing seasons shortened. Snow fell in June. Frost covered crops in August. But here's the terrifying part. No one knew why. There were no weather forecasts, no global communication, no headlines announcing disaster. Just farmers waking up to find their wheat frozen solid. Children shivering through summer nights. Villagers wondering what sin they had committed to bring this cold down upon them. From China to Canada, Ireland to India, the impact was nearly universal. In the Northern Hemisphere, the year 1816 became known as the year without a summer. Some called it 1800 and froze to death. Others simply referred to it as the poverty year. But this wasn't just one bad season. The eruption had triggered what scientists now call a volcanic winter, a sudden, sharp drop in global temperatures caused by sunlight-blocking particles in the upper atmosphere. In some places, the average temperature dropped by as much as 3 to 5 degrees Celsius, a number that might not sound dramatic until you realize how delicate our agricultural systems really are. That small change meant crops failed, grain never ripened, fruits withered, animals starved, and so did people. Still, no one connected the dots. There were no photographs, no satellites, no way to measure the skies. The people of Europe didn't know there had been an eruption in Indonesia. They just believed the seasons had turned on them. Some blamed God, some blamed sin. Others believed it was the sun itself, growing cold or fading out. There were even rumors that the world was ending. And in a way, it was. The world as they had known it, with dependable seasons and predictable harvests, was slipping away. In New England, farmers sowed their fields 3 times, only to watch frost destroy their crops over and over again. In France, desperate families dug up half-grown potatoes and ate them raw. In Switzerland, entire communities were reduced to begging or eating moss scraped from rocks. In Ireland, famine swept across the countryside, weakening the poor and setting the stage for future catastrophe. In India, the monsoon failed. Rivers dried. Rice paddies became dust. And with that drought came disease, cholera mostly, spreading through villages already weakened by hunger. Tens of thousands of people died. Many more would never forget the hunger, the helplessness, the endless cold. And yet, even through this darkness, life continued. Because it had to. People adapted. They found new ways to cook, to gather, to ration. Communities leaned on each other. And in some places, they even found strange beauty in the strange skies. That haunting red sunset. Those endless twilight hours. Artists painted them. Writers described them in long, dreamy poems. It's strange how the worst moments can still create art. But back in the villages, in the cabins, in the lonely hills, it was survival. The cold didn't feel poetic. It felt personal. It crept into your bones, your stomach, your dreams, and no one knew if it would end. There was no calendar for recovery, no back to normal, just hope and habit, and the small victories of making it through another night. So, as we go deeper into this story tonight, I want you to imagine the quiet fear of waking up each day in a world where the seasons are broken, where spring feels like winter and summer never comes, where the sky is too still, the earth too silent, and your stomach always a little too empty. But you still go on, because that's what people do. And they did. Across every corner of the world, people endured this strange, endless winter. They didn't understand it, but they faced it, just like we face our own long nights now, quietly, steadily, 1 hour at a time. Let's take a moment here. Breathe. Settle. And in a minute, we'll step into their world fully. See how they lived, how they ate, how they endured, not just the cold, but the uncertainty. Because this isn't just a story about weather. It's a story about the human heart and what it clings to when even the sun forgets to rise. The year is still 1816, and the cold hasn't lifted. Crops have failed again. You're standing in a muddy field, staring down at rows of shriveled plants that never had a chance. The summer was more like a cruel joke. Gray skies, bitter winds, frost-bitten mornings. The livestock is dying. The rivers run cold and high, swollen with relentless rain. Grain prices have doubled, then tripled. In some places, there simply isn't any to buy at all. The markets are empty, and the roads are full of desperate people searching for anything they can eat. And so now, we begin the quiet, grim chapter of survival. When people had to ask themselves, not what do we want for dinner, but what will keep us alive until morning. This is the story of what people ate when there was nothing left. The end of normal food. Before the skies darkened, food was already a fragile thing. The average family didn't have pantries full of dried goods or shelves of spices. Meals were based on whatever the land provided, season by season. When that rhythm shattered, so did the comfort of expectation. What had once been a modest but reliable diet, oats, barley, root vegetables, maybe a bit of pork fat or some cheese, collapsed. People clung to their food stores, but no amount of rationing could stretch it long enough. When you're cold, your body burns calories faster. The weak fell first. Infants, the elderly, those already ill. But no one was safe from the creeping ache of hunger. Farmers who had once fed entire villages were now unable to feed their own children. Bakers had no flour. Millers had no grain. Hunters found fewer animals in the woods. Even the wild things were suffering. What followed was one of the most silent and desperate famines in modern memory. And yet, people did what people always do. They adapted, however imperfectly, however painfully. Bark, moss, and leather, famine foods of desperation. Yes, bark. In some regions of Europe, people quite literally stripped trees of their bark. They boiled the soft inner layers, not the tough outer shell, hoping to soften them enough to be chewed or ground into paste. It didn't taste good. It didn't feel good in the stomach. But it was something. Moss was scraped from rocks and boiled into thin gruel. Entire hillsides were left bare. And while some mosses contain small amounts of nutrients, others are harsh on the human system. But when hunger presses in, the line between food and non-food begins to blur. Old leather belts and shoes were boiled into jelly. Once softened, they were sliced thin and swallowed slowly, like strips of overcooked noodles. The tanning process left them bitter and chemically treated. But still, it was calories, and calories were life. Even animal hides, if soaked and cooked long enough, were turned into makeshift stews. The collagen would break down after hours of boiling, resulting in a kind of greasy broth. Unpleasant? Absolutely. But this wasn't about cuisine. This was survival by any means. Blood pudding and bone broth. Those lucky enough to still have livestock began using every single part of the animal. Nothing went to waste. Blood was collected during slaughter and mixed with oats or barley, if available, to create blood pudding, a dense, protein-rich food that could be sliced and fried. Bones were cracked open with hammers to reach the marrow. Then they were boiled for hours, sometimes for days, to draw out any remaining fat or nutrients. What resulted was bone broth, cloudy and thin, but warm and slightly nourishing. Sometimes crushed bones were ground into powder and added to soups as thickener, not for taste, but for substance. Cats, dogs, rats, even horses, none were spared in the harshest regions. There are records from parts of Switzerland and France of entire neighborhoods consuming the remains of pets, zoo animals, or strays. Hunger has a way of eroding boundaries that would, in calmer times, feel sacred. Bread that wasn't bread. Real bread, with white flour, yeast, and salt, became a kind of mythical memory. People improvised. In place of flour, people ground up acorns, sawdust, or dried leaves. Acorns, once leached of their bitterness through long soaking, could be dried and turned into coarse powder. Mixed with water, it formed a dark, crumbly dough. It baked into something bread-shaped, heavy, bitter, but edible. Sawdust bread was more dangerous. The idea came from desperation, mixing ground wood pulp with a small amount of flour to stretch rations. But the body can't digest cellulose, and those who ate too much of this bread suffered bloating, intestinal distress, and worse. Still, people tried. Starvation leaves no room for discretion. Some mixed clay or ash with flour. This added bulk, but little else. In hindsight, these mixtures were almost more symbolic than nutritious, a way to pretend at normalcy. A loaf-shaped object still steaming from the hearth felt like hope. Foraging, scavenging, stealing. When cupboards emptied, people turned to the forests, fields, and hills. Whatever hadn't yet frozen solid or been picked clean. Nettles, dandelion leaves, wild sorrel, and dock were gathered as soon as they appeared in spring, boiled into soups. These weren't just weeds. They became medicine, nutrition, and sanity. For many, they were the first green thing they'd seen in months. Mushrooms were both a gift and a danger. Edible varieties could supplement a meager diet, but misidentification meant poisoning, illness, or death. Still, many risked it. Guides were passed down orally. Folk knowledge became life-saving expertise. In urban areas, scavenging turned into chaos. Food riots broke out in London, Paris, Vienna, and small towns across Europe. Bakeries were looted, storehouses burned. Those with food locked their doors and prayed. Some were killed over a sack of barley or a wheel of moldy cheese. Even the dead were not immune. Graves were disturbed in some desperate cases, not for food, but for buried goods or valuable clothing that might be traded for something edible. Hunger redefined morality, soup kitchens, and community resilience. But not all was hopeless. In many cities, soup kitchens sprang up, organized by churches, charities, or local leaders. These offered thin stews made from donated goods, bones, and scraps. They couldn't feed everyone, but they kept the poorest from dying in the streets. Communal ovens were reopened, allowing those with small amounts of flour to bake in larger batches. People shared meals more openly than before. Hunger, after all, is a powerful equalizer. A neighbor's crust of bread could mean the difference between despair and survival. In rural areas, entire villages would pool their remaining food. One family had potatoes, another had a few chickens, someone else had herbs. Meals became shared rituals, cooked over single fires, eaten in silence, sometimes tears. It wasn't just the body that needed warmth, it was the spirit. Children and the question of feeding the future. Of all the tragedies, the hunger of children weighed heaviest. Infants couldn't be breastfed if their mothers were starving. Older children developed swollen bellies, brittle bones, and sunken eyes, signs of kwashiorkor and marasmus, malnutrition conditions rarely seen in modern times, but common then. Some families abandoned infants at orphanages, hoping they'd stand a better chance. Others made choices they could never forget, splitting what little they had and pretending they weren't hungry so their children could eat just one more spoonful of something warm. Milk was a luxury. Goats and cows stopped producing when they weren't fed. Some mothers fed their babies watered-down broth or mashed grains. Others used animal blood as an emergency formula. These are not comfortable truths, but they are part of the quiet endurance of those years. The taste of survival. So what did it all taste like? Bitter, metallic, gamey, bland, acidic, burnt, sour. The food of famine isn't remembered for its flavor. It's remembered for its function, to survive, to outlast, to make it to spring. The body adapts to hunger in strange ways. Taste dulls, the stomach shrinks. Meals become sacred, even if they're just warm water with a slice of boiled bark floating inside. And still, people survived. Not all, but many. Enough to pass on these memories. Enough to whisper, even now, across the centuries, what it means to truly be hungry. To make food out of nothing. To keep going, one bitter mouthful at a time. Cleanliness was not a choice, not a luxury. It was survival. But in this year, hygiene began to unravel. With crop failures, famine, bitter cold, and relentless rains, the world of 1816 was not just hungry, it was filthy. The mud crept into homes, soot clung to walls, water ran thick from the hills. People did not wash as often. They could not afford the warmth to do so. When the world outside was soaking wet and freezing, and every bit of firewood mattered, warm water became more precious than soap. Yet, people tried. They had to. Soap and the effort to stay clean soap wasn't something you bought easily in 1816, especially during a crisis. In rural areas, it was made at home, slowly and with care. Animal fat, left over from slaughter, was saved and stored. Then, lye was made by pouring water through hardwood ashes. It was caustic, dangerous to the skin in its raw form, but effective. Combine the fat and lye, boil it down, stir it for hours, and you might get a soft, harsh-smelling soap. That's when the world worked as expected. But that year, fires were limited. Ashes were wet. Fat was scarce. People needed every scrap for food or candles, and without fat, there was no soap. Still, people got creative. They used clay, sand, and ashes to scrub their hands. A rough rub with snow helped cleanse the skin. Cold water and rags were soaked with herbs like lavender, rosemary, or thyme, when available, to mask the scent of unwashed bodies. In towns, public bathhouses were either overwhelmed or shut down. Fuel shortages, disease fears, and riot control kept many closed, so people returned to older methods: heated stones dropped in buckets, steam in cellars, quick rinses with icy water. It was uncomfortable, it was rushed, but it helped. And still, many could not manage even that. Clothes, layers, filth, and function one set of clothes, maybe two. In this year, that was all most people had, and they wore them constantly. Shirts grew stiff with sweat and soot. Undergarments were patched and repatched until fabric could no longer hold thread. Lice and fleas were common. Itches spread across backs and thighs. Some used vinegar to cleanse the seams. Others boiled garments, risking damage just to feel something close to clean. Wool took forever to dry. Linen froze if left outside, so people would sit, half naked, near their hearths, steaming off the stink of soaked clothes. Some slept in their outerwear, not from laziness, but from necessity. Undressing meant risking warmth, and heat was more valuable than hygiene. Rags were sewn into undergarments to absorb sweat or menstrual blood, then cleaned with snow or hung above the fire. Not often, just enough. For those who could, urine was collected and stored in clay jars. A harsh cleaner, it was used to disinfect wounds, scrub floors, and even bleach fabrics. Its smell was sharp, unmistakable, but it worked. It killed fleas. It softened leather. And during this year, it was better than nothing. Teeth, hair, and the small rituals of cleanliness. Teeth were brushed with ashes, chalk, or charcoal rubbed on cloth. The lucky had brushes made from horsehair or soft roots. More often, people used fingers. A quick rinse with salt water if they had some, sometimes with vinegar. Cavities were common, and when the pain grew unbearable, teeth were pulled by hand or heated tongs. No anesthetic, just something to bite on and scream into. Hair was washed maybe once every few weeks, using boiled herbs or broth if soap was unavailable. Most just combed with bone or wood combs, pulling lice from roots, squashing them between fingernails. Children's heads were often shaved outright. Women braided their hair tight and left it for weeks, while men wore caps that grew oily from sweat. But those small rituals, combing, parting, braiding, gave people a sense of control. A reminder that their bodies, though suffering, still belonged to them. Human waste, the quiet danger. Without modern plumbing, waste management was already difficult. In 1816, it became dangerous. Chamber pots filled quickly. The cold made emptying them harder. Privies overflowed or froze. In cities, the streets stank. Gutters ran with filth. In rural areas, waste was tossed onto fields or into shallow pits. But snowmelt and constant rain turned these into breeding grounds for disease. Typhoid, dysentery, cholera. They didn't need much to start. Wells were contaminated. Buckets dipped downstream carried infection. A sick child's vomit or a contaminated rag could spread illness across entire families. And in winter, when bodies were weak from hunger and warmth was rare, these diseases killed quickly. Some communities tried digging deeper pits. Others burned rags and bedding. A few had midwives or old women who understood the importance of boiling cloth, burning waste, using lime. But many did not. The science wasn't widely known. And what was known often got lost beneath panic, exhaustion, and grief. Hands, always dirty, always busy. Hands were everything. You grew food with them, killed animals, cleaned the sick, wiped tears, lit fires, carried water, covered your face from the cold, but they were hard to keep clean. Soap was rare, water was often icy, gloves were a privilege, and so hands cracked, fingernails blackened with soot and dirt, cuts and scratches became infected easily. Some smeared honey or animal fat on wounds. Others used crushed garlic, vinegar, salt. Hands aged fast in 1816. You could see years written into the skin of a child's palm. And those who had lost the strength to scrub, to clean, to heal, you knew they were close to breaking. Bedding, warmth, and the battle with vermin. Bedding was never washed. It was aired out, if possible, hung above fires, beaten with sticks, but the feathers and wool inside grew musty, damp, crawling. Bed bugs, lice, and fleas made their homes in the seams. People scratched themselves raw in the night. Children cried. Adults muttered in their sleep. Ash was sprinkled into sheets. Some boiled hay to stuff mattresses anew. Others lined their beds with crushed herbs, mint, wormwood, bay leaves, anything to chase the insects away. It didn't work for long. Still, people clung to blankets like lifelines, even the itchy ones, even the damp ones. They wrapped themselves like mummies, held their children close, shared body heat beneath quilts that hadn't been truly clean in months. Public spaces and collective filth markets, churches, inns, all became breeding grounds. Foot traffic in wet shoes, people coughing into cloth, infants squalling, a merchant's table covered in mildew, the smell of wet wool, rotting meat, and unwashed hair, candles flickering, mud puddles tracked indoors, rats darting beneath pews. In cities, this was daily life. You stepped outside your door and entered a wave of filth and noise. You learned to breathe shallowly, to eat quickly, to wipe your mouth with your sleeve and move on. Some churches began offering basins near the door. Others handed out vinegar rags. A few town leaders ordered streets scrubbed with ash and water. But none of it was enough. There were too many people. Not enough hands, not enough fire, not enough light. The burden on women bore the brunt of it. They cleaned the rags, heated the water, dug the latrines, washed the sick, brushed lice from children's scalps, scraped frost from bedding, scrubbed chamber pots with snow, and they suffered for it. Their hands cracked, their backs bent, their hair thinned. They burned themselves trying to keep fires alive. They cut their palms on frozen pots. They caught the same illnesses they nursed, and still kept working. And when their children cried for warmth or their husbands collapsed from exhaustion, they wiped their faces clean with ragged sleeves and told them, just a bit longer. Not because they believed it, but because someone had to say it. When clean wasn't possible. There were those who gave up, who let the dirt build up, who stopped cleaning wounds, who slept in soiled clothes, who let the lice have their way. You could smell it on them, see it in their eyes, the quiet surrender. It wasn't laziness, it was despair, a mind that had run out of energy to care about anything but breathing. Neighbors whispered, some helped, others turned away. Cleanliness, in this time, was a small act of defiance, a stubborn claim that life was still worth living. So when someone took the time to scrub a floor, boil a bandage, brush a child's teeth, it meant something. It meant they still believed they might survive this. Hygiene and dignity. It's easy to overlook, from the safety of the modern world, how much hygiene is about dignity. In 1816, to wash your hands before a meal, to brush your hair, to mend your clothes, these were acts of pride, of humanity. And in a year where people were reduced to bark bread and bone broth, that dignity mattered more than ever. They were cold, hungry, exhausted, but they were still people, still reaching for something clean, something warm, something that reminded them of who they were before the sky turned gray. And somehow, they held on. As the bitter winds howled outside and the thatch above their heads creaked with every icy gust, medieval peasants didn't just rely on their physical grit and limited resources to make it through winter. They leaned, perhaps even more heavily, on something unseen: faith, superstition, and belief. For them, the long, dark nights weren't just a test of the body, but a test of the spirit. And in the face of relentless hardship, it wasn't unusual to look skyward, or anywhere at all, for answers. In a world lit only by fire, the darkness wasn't just a lack of light. It was a presence. It was something that crept into homes, whispered through door cracks, and loomed just outside the fragile safety of the hearth. The colder and darker it got, the closer death felt, and so people filled that darkness with meaning, with stories, with hope. Religion, folklore, omens, charms, these weren't just entertainment or idle beliefs. They were survival tools, as important as firewood or turnips. The Christian church played a huge role, of course. In medieval Europe, Christianity was more than just a Sunday affair. It saturated daily life. And when winter came, bringing illness, famine, and fear, the church provided explanations. Hard winters were often seen as divine punishment, trials sent from God to test the faithful, and just as often, prayers, penance, and devotion were seen as tools of resistance, ways to shield the soul from the cold, even if the body remained exposed. People prayed to saints for protection. Saint Nicholas, known for his generosity, was often invoked during the leanest times of year. Saint Apollonia was turned to when the cold made teeth ache. Saint Sebastian was prayed to during outbreaks of winter sickness, especially when the flu or something worse made its rounds. Candles were lit. Crosses were etched into doors with soot. Children were taught prayers not only for salvation, but for warmth. But beneath the polished sermons of the church, older and wilder beliefs still thrived, especially among the poor, who had less access to books, priests, or formal education. Pagan customs had never quite died, and in the quiet of winter, when nature seemed to sleep but danger was everywhere, these beliefs stirred. People believed in spirits, both helpful and harmful, that roamed more freely in the winter months. The Wild Hunt, a ghostly procession of spectral riders said to sweep across the sky during storms, was feared in many regions. Those caught outside during one of these mysterious rides might disappear or return changed. Some believed that the dead were more restless during the cold season, and stories of wandering souls were common. Homes were protected with charms made of straw, iron, salt, or whatever a family could afford to spare. Folk magic was not exotic. It was everyday. A sprig of holly over a door wasn't just decoration. It was protection. A fire left burning overnight on Christmas Eve might invite blessings from passing spirits, or, depending on the tale, keep evil ones at bay. In some areas, peasants left offerings out, bread, mead, or even scraps of meat, to pacify the unseen forces believed to wander in the cold. Dreams, too, were watched carefully during winter. The long nights meant more sleep, and sleep meant more dreaming. A dream of fire might signal good fortune. A dream of falling snow could be a warning. Some kept dream journals, though more often, elders simply remembered. Wisdom wasn't something kept in books. It was spoken from memory, passed down in whispers beside the fire. There were stories told of witches and winter spirits, of women who could call down snowstorms with a chant, or curse the butter to spoil if insulted. Though often feared, these figures were also sometimes approached for help. When sickness came, and the church was far away, and there were no herbs left to brew, well, an old woman at the edge of the woods might have a charm, or a poultice, or a whispered prayer that just might work. Desperation didn't care much about orthodoxy. Even simple acts took on deeper meaning. Stirring the winter porridge in a clockwise direction brought health. Hanging garlic near the door kept misfortune away. If a rooster crowed at the wrong time, it was a sign to stay indoors. Shadows in the snow, strange animal behavior, the shape of frost on the window, all of these could be interpreted. In a world where you couldn't control the cold, people learned to read the signs of it, as if the world were constantly trying to whisper something important. Winter holidays were, unsurprisingly, deeply spiritual. Christmas, yes, but also St. Lucy's Day, the Epiphany, and the Feast of St. Bridget in early February. These moments were a break in the bleakness, marked with light, with candles, with shared food and prayers. They were hopeful pauses, meant to remind everyone that light would return, eventually. Still, not all belief was gentle. The devil was seen as especially active during the darkest months. Temptation was more dangerous when hunger gnawed and bodies weakened. Illness, theft, cruelty. These were thought to be signs of sin's creeping hand. People confessed more in winter. They fasted. They made promises to change. The soul was always at risk, and cold, in the minds of many, was more than a weather pattern. It was spiritual warfare, and in every village, every hut, there were private rituals too, quiet habits passed from parent to child, rubbing the hearthstone for luck, always entering and exiting the house through the same door in December, never throwing water out at night without a whispered apology to the spirits. These small actions carried enormous weight because belief, in the absence of control, gave people a kind of power. The line between superstition and survival was blurry. Whether a charm truly worked or not didn't matter as much as the comfort it gave. A talisman might not keep the sickness away, but it gave a mother something to do. A prayer to whisper over her sleeping children. A bit of hope to hold when all else felt lost. And in a strange way, the cold helped these beliefs endure. When you're struggling just to make it to spring, there's little time to question old wisdom. If something helped last year, or even felt like it helped, you kept doing it, because the alternative wasn't just skepticism, it was risk. And when risk came with the price of frostbite, famine, or death, even the most curious minds learned to lean on tradition. By late winter, when food stores were nearly gone and illness had taken its toll, these beliefs often became more intense. Candlemas brought the blessing of fire and warmth. Households would burn their last bits of dried herbs, sweep out the hearth, and whisper prayers of cleansing. The worst of winter was passing, but it wasn't gone, and so the rituals continued until finally the ground softened, the light returned, and faith for another year had carried them through. So yes, medieval winters were brutal on the body, but also on the mind and soul. And it wasn't just turnips and hay that kept people alive. It was stories. It was faith. It was the simple belief that even in the darkest, coldest season, light could still be found, even if it flickered faintly from a candle, reflected in frost, or lingered in the half-remembered words of a grandmother's tale. Winter in medieval times wasn't just a battle against the biting cold and scarce food. It was a time when fear, hope, and faith intertwined deeply in the hearts of peasants. The long nights, eerie stillness, and relentless hardships made the cold season a fertile ground for superstition, rituals, and religious devotion. For many, these beliefs were not just quaint traditions, they were essential tools for mental survival, giving meaning and comfort amid the brutal uncertainty. Medieval peasants lived in a world where the divine and the supernatural were inseparable from daily life. Churches were often the heart of the village, and the rhythm of the year revolved around religious festivals. But winter was also the darkest time spiritually, not only physically. The sun retreated, days grew shorter, and a tangible sense of vulnerability settled in. People believed that during these months, the boundary between the natural and the supernatural thinned, allowing evil spirits, witches, and ghosts to roam more freely. The church offered solace and structure. Attending Mass, praying the Rosary, and observing fasting rules weren't just acts of faith, but ways to seek protection. Many peasants believed that holy water sprinkled on the home or livestock could ward off illness and evil influences. Small charms, often blessed by priests, were tucked into clothes or hung over doors. Saints' days in winter, like St. Lucy's Day in December, were seen as beacons of light in the encroaching darkness, moments when the community could gather and renew hope. Yet alongside the church's teachings, a rich tapestry of folklore and superstition flourished, sometimes blending seamlessly with Christian beliefs. For example, the Yule log, a tradition inherited from pagan winter solstice customs, was carefully chosen and burned in the hearth to bring luck and warmth throughout the cold months. The ashes were kept and scattered on fields in spring to ensure fertility. Witches and cunning folk were often blamed when livestock died, crops failed, or family members fell ill during winter. This fear of the supernatural could lead to desperate measures, from protective charms to rituals intended to identify or banish malevolent forces. Winter was considered the season when these dark powers were most active, and it wasn't unusual for neighbors to watch each other with suspicion, heightening the already tense atmosphere. Many rituals were deeply practical as well. For example, some villages held communal prayers or processions during the bleak midwinter to petition for an early spring or a mild winter. These gatherings reinforced social bonds and gave peasants a sense of control in an uncontrollable world. Storytelling around the fire often involved legends and cautionary tales about winter spirits or saints who protected the vulnerable. The role of the church was complex. While it preached salvation and hope, it also reinforced fear of sin and divine punishment. For peasants, winter was sometimes viewed as a test of faith, a trial to be endured patiently. Those who persevered would be rewarded in the afterlife. This belief gave many the strength to face the harsh conditions, to accept suffering as part of a divine plan, rather than a meaningless hardship. In the privacy of their homes, families might observe small personal rituals, crossing themselves before sleep, burning candles to keep away evil, or leaving out food for protective spirits or saints. The line between superstition and genuine religious practice was often blurred, creating a spiritual landscape that was both comforting and unsettling. The importance of saints and religious icons in winter cannot be overstated. Peasants might carry small carved crosses or wear pendants depicting protective saints believed to guard against the cold and disease. Stories of miraculous healings or protection attributed to saints were shared widely, spreading hope. The harshness of winter also inspired creative expressions of faith, such as hymns and prayers specifically for the season. These were sometimes passed down orally, sung during communal gatherings, or quietly recited in solitude. Their calming, repetitive nature provided a mental refuge, a way to find peace amid the storm. Even superstition had its practical side. For example, some beliefs encouraged prudence and resourcefulness, not wasting firewood lest it anger the spirits, or avoiding certain foods or actions believed to bring bad luck. These customs often doubled as ways to manage scarce resources or maintain community order. As the days gradually lengthened toward spring, winter rituals and superstitions would shift to celebrate survival and renewal. Festivals like Candlemas in February marked the turning point, reminding peasants that the dark season was ending and brighter times were near. These moments of communal joy and relief were as vital to mental survival as the practical measures taken to endure the cold. In essence, the faith and superstitions of medieval peasants were more than relics of a superstitious age. They were lifelines in a world where physical survival was precarious and uncertain. They shaped how people understood their place in the cosmos, giving order to chaos and meaning to suffering. This deep connection between belief and endurance is what allowed medieval peasants not just to survive winter, but to face it with a sense of purpose and resilience. Their stories of faith, fear, and hope echo across centuries, reminding us of the power of human spirit in even the coldest, darkest nights. When the harsh grip of winter settled over medieval villages, clothing wasn't just about fashion or modesty. It was the front-line defense against a relentless cold that could quickly turn deadly. For peasants who had neither wealth nor access to fine materials, clothing was a blend of necessity, resourcefulness, and tradition. Understanding how they dressed and layered themselves reveals a lot about their resilience and the practical challenges they faced. Peasant garments were primarily made from wool and linen, two fabrics that were accessible and practical for everyday wear. Wool, often coarser than what we think of today, was the key fabric for winter clothing. Its natural properties made it warm and somewhat water-resistant, though far from perfect. The wool came from sheep they raised themselves or traded for, spun into yarn and woven into thick cloth by local weavers, or sometimes the peasants themselves. Layering was essential. On the coldest days, a peasant might wear a rough linen shirt as a base layer. Linen was lighter and breathable but offered little warmth alone. Over this, they would add one or more woolen tunics or jackets. The more layers, the better. But with each added piece came the trade-off of reduced mobility and increased weight. People learned to balance warmth with the ability to work. Too many layers could slow down the chores that were vital to survival. Outer garments often included a cloak or mantle, made from heavier wool or sometimes animal pelts. Cloaks served multiple purposes, wrapping around the body for warmth, shielding against rain or snow, and even doubling as blankets during the night. Some cloaks were fastened with simple wooden or metal brooches, functional yet occasionally ornate enough to show a bit of personality or status. Animal skins and furs, when available, were prized possessions. Hunters, or those lucky enough to barter with trappers, might have a sheepskin coat or rabbit fur gloves. These offered superior insulation, especially around extremities like hands, feet, and heads, areas most vulnerable to frostbite. But furs were rare for peasants. Often, they had to make do with patchworked or worn wool garments, sometimes mended repeatedly with scraps of cloth. Headwear was vital in winter. A thick woolen cap, sometimes lined with fur, helped retain body heat. Those without proper hats might improvise by wrapping scarves or strips of cloth. Protecting ears and neck was crucial, since exposure often led to painful frostbite. Footwear was similarly basic but important. Wooden clogs or simple leather boots lined with straw or wool helped keep feet insulated from frozen ground. Peasants often stuffed their shoes with dried grass or rags, to create extra padding and warmth. Underneath all the layers, garments were often rough, itchy, and far from the soft fabrics we enjoy today. The coarse texture of wool could irritate skin, and hygiene was limited by the scarcity of clean water and washing opportunities. Despite this discomfort, layering and material choice were key to survival rather than comfort. Color was mostly muted. Natural browns, grays, and off-whites dominated. Dyes were expensive and reserved for wealthier classes or special occasions. However, small touches like decorative stitching, simple embroidery, or colored trims might appear, reflecting local traditions or personal flair. Clothing maintenance was a constant challenge. Garments were expensive to replace, so peasants patched holes, darned socks, and repurposed old fabric scraps. Mending was often done by women, who passed down skills and techniques through generations. The smell of damp wool, sweat, and smoke was a constant companion, but keeping clothes functional was non-negotiable. Layering wasn't just practical, it was almost ritualistic. As winter approached, preparing clothes involved more than just pulling out thick coats. Peasants inspected their wardrobes, repaired what they could, and planned how best to combine garments for maximum warmth. Knowing how to dress properly was a form of knowledge passed down, essential for enduring the months ahead. Interestingly, clothing also played a social role. During festivals or church gatherings, peasants might wear their best or cleanest garments, which, though simple, symbolized pride and community identity. Winter clothing, though worn daily, carried cultural weight, representing endurance and readiness for hardship. In many ways, the act of layering was a physical expression of the layered hardships of winter. Protection built piece by piece, much like the communities that held each other together. Every stitch and patch was a testament to survival, adaptation, and quiet dignity. So when you think about medieval peasants in winter, picture not just the cold, but the careful, deliberate layering of every piece of worn cloth, each one a shield against the merciless cold, each one a story of endurance passed down through generations. When you think about medieval life, hygiene isn't usually the first thing that comes to mind. It wasn't exactly a time of hot showers, scented soaps, or daily baths. In fact, for many peasants, cleanliness was a complicated luxury, especially during the harsh winter months when water froze and the cold made washing up a daunting task. But surviving winter was not just about keeping warm and having enough food. It also meant doing everything possible to stay healthy, to avoid sickness, and to manage hygiene with whatever means were available. Let's start with the basics. Water. Clean water was precious, and winter often made it scarce or difficult to access. Streams and wells might freeze over, and hauling buckets of water from distant sources could mean risking frostbite or exhaustion. So, peasants often had to make do with what they could find, sometimes melting snow, sometimes scraping ice from frozen ponds, hoping the water wasn't too dirty. This limited water supply meant that regular bathing was rare at best. Bathing itself was a different experience in medieval times. Contrary to popular myths, many peasants did bathe, but often only once a week or even less, depending on the season. In summer, a dip in a nearby river or pond might be possible, but winter was a different story. The cold temperatures made even washing hands or faces a chilling ordeal. Instead, many relied on wiping themselves down with cloths or rinsing only the face and hands, focusing on practicality over comfort. Soap existed, but it wasn't the fragrant bar of today's showers. It was typically made from animal fat and wood ash, a harsh and coarse mixture that could dry out skin. So, It was used sparingly, and many people simply washed with plain water or rubbed their skin with rough cloths. To combat the drying and cracking effects of cold and washing, people used natural oils and animal fats to moisturize their skin, which also offered a thin layer of protection against the biting wind. Hair hygiene was another challenge. Peasants often wore their hair long for warmth, but lice were common and could be a serious problem. Combings and picking were part of daily life, especially in winter, when close quarters made lice spread easily. Some folk remedies existed. Herbs like rosemary, lavender, or sage might be burned to create smoke that was believed to repel lice, or rinses made from boiled herbs were used to cleanse hair. Dental care was minimal. There were no toothbrushes or toothpaste as we know them, but chewing on twigs from certain trees or rinsing the mouth with herbal infusions was practiced by some. Still, tooth decay and gum disease were common afflictions, exacerbated by a diet often heavy in coarse grains and little fresh produce during winter months. The cold itself brought its own set of health challenges. Frostbite was a constant threat, especially for those who spent time outdoors without adequate clothing or shelter. Skin could crack, bleed, and become infected. Cold and damp conditions were perfect breeding grounds for respiratory illnesses. Coughs, colds, and pneumonia were all too common in the winter. Without modern medicine, such illnesses could be fatal, especially for children and the elderly. But peasants weren't completely helpless. They used a variety of herbal remedies and traditional knowledge passed down through generations. Plants like garlic, elderberry, willow bark, and yarrow were staples of the medieval medicine chest, believed to fight infections, reduce fevers, or ease pain. Some villages had wise women or herbalists who acted as healers, mixing poultices and tinctures from whatever plants they could find, even in winter. In terms of sanitation, things were far from what we consider clean today. Chamber pots were common indoors, often emptied into the streets or fields outside. Waste management was crude, and in winter, the frozen ground made digging latrines difficult. This meant that people had to be careful to avoid contaminating their living spaces. But with limited resources and crowded homes, outbreaks of diseases linked to poor sanitation were frequent. Despite these hardships, the social aspect of hygiene was important too. Communal washing areas existed in some villages, often by streams or wells, where people could wash clothes or bathe in warmer months. These gatherings also allowed for social interaction and sharing of news or remedies, helping strengthen community bonds, which were vital for surviving long winters. Winter also meant less sunlight and fresh air, which had psychological impacts. People spent more time indoors, close together, which helped retain warmth, but also facilitated the spread of illnesses. Ventilation was limited. Windows were small or covered with animal skins, so the air inside could become stale and heavy. Smoke from fires helped disinfect the air somewhat, but soot and smoke inhalation were problems in themselves. The mental toll of winter sickness and poor hygiene practices was not insignificant. Fear of illness, combined with the isolation and darkness, could weigh heavily on the minds of peasants. Yet, resilience was key. Practical habits like steaming herbs to clear lungs, rubbing oils onto skin to prevent cracking, and using hot drinks to keep spirits up were all part of their quiet fight against winter's grip. So, while medieval peasants couldn't rely on modern hygiene standards, their resourcefulness and community practices helped them manage through cold months with limited means. They understood that survival wasn't just about keeping the body warm, but also about protecting it from the hidden dangers winter brought, from invisible germs to biting frost, using whatever tools, knowledge, and sheer grit they had. As we move forward in our journey, we'll continue to uncover the many layers of medieval life, always circling back to how these ordinary people endured some of the harshest conditions history has seen, in ways that might surprise you, and in ways that still echo through time. When winter arrived in medieval times, the biting cold wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a relentless enemy that demanded every ounce of preparation and resilience. And at the heart of surviving those brutal months was shelter. How peasants kept themselves protected from the harsh weather often made the difference between life and death. Unlike today's insulated homes, modern heating, or even sturdy walls, medieval peasants lived in homes that were simple, fragile, and exposed to the elements. But within those humble walls lay centuries of hard-earned knowledge and clever adaptations, little victories of warmth in an unforgiving world. Most peasants lived in what's called a wattle and daub house. Imagine a skeleton of thin, crooked wooden sticks woven together like a giant basket. This crude frame was then smeared with a sticky mixture of mud, straw, and sometimes animal dung. It's not the most glamorous material, but it did the job. It kept the rain mostly out and blocked enough wind to make the inside just a tiny bit less like standing outside. Still, these walls were far from airtight. You could hear the wind whistle through every crack and gap, and drafts were a constant nuisance. The roofs were thatched, bundles of dried straw, reeds, or rushes carefully layered to shed water and snow. Thatched roofs looked charming from a distance, but up close, they were a patchwork of vulnerability. After weeks of rain, snow, and frost, the thatch would sag and leak, letting in chilly drops and sometimes unwelcome visitors. A curious squirrel or two dropping in on an unsuspecting peasant's dinner. Roof repairs were an ongoing winter chore, and having enough dry straw at hand was a matter of great importance. Windows, if they existed, were tiny and simple. Glass was rare and expensive, reserved mostly for the wealthy elite. Peasants often covered window holes with thin animal hides, like stretched-out cow or pig skin, or wooden shutters. These coverings let in very little light, and even less warmth, making the interior dark and cold. At night, with only the flickering glow of a hearth fire to light the room, shadows would dance eerily on the rough walls. Speaking of the hearth, this was the centerpiece of any medieval home, especially in winter. It was the source of warmth, cooking, and light, all rolled into one. A simple stone or clay fireplace, sometimes just a fire pit dug into the floor, with a chimney if the home was lucky. The fire's smoke often filled the room before drifting up the chimney, adding to the slightly smoky, earthy atmosphere. Keeping the fire going was a full-time job. Wood had to be chopped, gathered, and dried, a task made harder when the ground was frozen and snow covered the forest floor. Peasants often had to use whatever wood was available, branches, scrap wood, even old furniture, to fuel their fires through long nights. Smoke was both a blessing and a curse. It helped keep insects away and even sanitize the air a bit, but it also blackened walls and lungs. Because the homes were small, often a single room served multiple purposes: cooking, eating, sleeping, and even sheltering animals at night. Yes, many peasants brought livestock indoors during winter: sheep, goats, or chickens, not just to protect the animals from predators, but because their body heat added a bit of warmth to the house. The smell, though, was a small price to pay for the extra degrees of heat in a freezing world. Inside the home, peasants used several clever tricks to conserve heat. Walls might be plastered with extra layers of mud or dung mixed with straw to reduce drafts. Doorways were sometimes covered with heavy cloths or animal skins instead of doors to keep warm air inside. Floors were packed dirt, cold and unforgiving, but straw mats or rushes were strewn across the ground to add a thin, insulating layer. People might even pile straw or rushes higher near sleeping areas to trap warmth close to where they lay. Beds were often simple wooden frames with sacks stuffed with straw or hay for padding. These beds were far from soft or cozy by modern standards, but the straw offered some insulation from the cold floor below. Sometimes bedding would be layered with animal furs or thick woolen blankets, prized possessions that were carefully saved and handed down. Sharing beds was common too. Families huddled close to preserve body heat during the coldest nights. Ventilation was a delicate balance. Keep the home sealed tight to trap heat, and smoke and moisture from cooking and breathing could build up dangerously. Open a window or door for fresh air, and the warmth escaped into the cold night. This challenge meant peasants had to manage their hearth fires carefully, keeping smoke at bay while ensuring enough airflow to avoid suffocation or respiratory problems. Outside the home, peasants also used simple shelters for storage, small sheds or barns for tools, firewood, and food stores. Keeping these supplies dry was essential, as wet wood wouldn't burn well, and spoiled food meant hunger. In some villages, underground cellars or pits were dug to store root vegetables and preserves, using the earth itself as natural insulation against freezing temperatures. Communal living and shared resources played a significant role in winter survival. Villages often clustered homes together, creating small pockets of warmth that could help withstand storms. Neighbors shared firewood, food, and sometimes even shelter during the worst weather. The social fabric was a vital source of resilience, as isolation in winter could be deadly. In castles and manor houses, the wealthy enjoyed somewhat better shelter and heating. But even there, winter was a formidable foe. Large stone walls were cold and damp, and heating those vast halls was a challenge. Great fireplaces blazed in main rooms, but only a few rooms might be heated. Peasants, meanwhile, huddled in far smaller, simpler spaces, but were masters of making do. In essence, medieval winter shelter and heating was a game of resourcefulness, using limited materials, making every bit of warmth count, and relying heavily on community and ingenuity. The cold was an ever-present threat, but these homes, with their smoky hearths and straw-lined floors, were sanctuaries of survival. They were places where families gathered, stories were shared, and the fierce spirit of endurance burned bright against the darkest and coldest nights. When you think about medieval peasants surviving brutal winters, one of their greatest assets wasn't just their own grit or thick woolen clothes, it was their animals. Livestock was not only a source of food, but also warmth, companionship, and even labor that could mean the difference between life and death during those freezing months. Peasants typically kept a few essential animals. Cows, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens were the usual suspects. Each of these played a unique role in winter survival, and how peasants managed them was critical to making it through the season. Let's start with cows and goats. These animals provided milk, an indispensable source of nutrition when fresh vegetables and fruits were nowhere to be found. Milk could be consumed directly, but more importantly, it was turned into cheese and butter, which stored better and could last through the winter months. Cheese was a compact, high-energy food, and butter, despite being a luxury for many peasants, was essential for cooking and added much-needed calories. Cows and goats also generated body heat, which peasants cleverly used to their advantage. In some homes, animals were kept in attached shelters or in the lower part of the house. The warmth from their bodies helped raise the temperature inside the dwelling, creating a slightly more bearable environment for the people living there. It was far from cozy, but every little bit of heat mattered when outside temperatures plunged well below freezing. Sheep had a double benefit. Besides producing wool, which was spun and woven into warm clothing, they were also a food source. Sheep meat was often reserved for special occasions or emergencies because the animals were more valuable alive for their wool. The wool itself was a lifeline. It was layered into garments, blankets, and even bedding, offering insulation that was absolutely vital in those freezing, drafty homes. Pigs, on the other hand, were primarily raised for meat. Unlike other animals, pigs didn't provide milk or wool, but their ability to fatten up before winter made them important food reserves. Peasants often slaughtered pigs in late autumn, curing the meat by smoking or salting it to last through the cold months. Pork fat was another critical ingredient. It was used in cooking and sometimes rubbed onto the skin to prevent chapping and frostbite. Chickens laid eggs and provided meat, although eggs were more common before the harshest part of winter set in. Chickens were relatively easy to care for, and their small size made them practical even in cramped winter quarters. Aside from the practical uses of animals, there was also the emotional and psychological comfort they provided. In a world of constant struggle and hardship, having animals nearby could offer a sense of companionship. The simple act of tending to animals gave peasants a routine and a focus beyond the biting cold and scarce resources. But winter also posed serious challenges for livestock. Food for animals became scarce, and peasants had to plan ahead, saving enough fodder like hay and grains to keep their animals alive when pastures were buried under snow. Starving animals meant starvation for the people who depended on them. In many cases, harsh winters led to massive losses in livestock, which could cripple a peasant family's survival chances. Peasants also had to protect their animals from the cold. Though animals were hardier than humans, they still needed shelter. Stables or simple barns were built using whatever materials were available: wood, mud, straw, to shield animals from wind and snow. Sometimes, animals were even brought inside the main living quarters, despite the added dirt and smell, simply because it was better than the brutal chill outside. In addition to shelter, peasants used simple tricks to keep animals warm, like piling straw or hay for bedding, ensuring the floors weren't just cold dirt, and positioning animals away from prevailing winds. This care required constant attention, as the health of animals directly impacted the family's food supply and income. Looking beyond just their own animals, peasants sometimes relied on wild game during winter. Hunting, though difficult, provided supplementary meat and fur, which could be crucial during long winters. Trapping small animals like rabbits or birds, fishing through ice holes, and foraging for hardy plants or roots were all part of the survival toolkit. In essence, animals were lifelines. They were sources of food, warmth, clothing materials, and even emotional support. Without them, medieval peasants would have faced far harsher winters, and many would have succumbed to starvation or exposure. In the medieval world, trade and supply chains were the invisible threads that connected peasants and townspeople alike to goods they couldn't produce themselves. But when winter arrived, the harshest, most unforgiving season, those threads often grew thin, stretched, and sometimes snapped altogether. For medieval peasants, the coming of winter meant much more than just bundling up and bracing against the cold. It was a race against time to secure the essentials: food, fuel, tools, and materials that couldn't be grown or gathered in the frozen months. Understanding how trade worked or struggled during winter offers us a fascinating glimpse into the resilience and resourcefulness of medieval communities. Before winter set in, merchants, traders, and local markets buzzed with urgency. Farmers and peasants would sell or barter surplus goods from their harvests: grains, salted meat, dried fruits, and firewood. These goods were stockpiled or transported to towns, castles, and cities where demand remained high despite the season. But once snow covered the land and roads turned treacherous, this delicate balance was thrown off. Roads were the lifelines for medieval trade, but winter was their fiercest enemy. Mud turned to ice, and narrow paths through forests and hills became hazardous or impassable. Heavy snowfall could block mountain passes for weeks, cutting off entire regions. This meant goods that were once easily transported now faced delays, shortages, and spoilage. Rivers, which often served as natural trade routes, froze or swelled dangerously with winter runoff. Boats and barges that carried grain or timber had to be pulled from the water, halting river trade entirely until spring thaw. For many towns dependent on river traffic, winter meant scarcity and higher prices. This seasonality forced merchants to plan months ahead. They had to predict demand, stockpile enough goods, and arrange safe storage to ensure supplies lasted through the darkest months. Granaries were filled, barrels of salted meat and fish were packed tightly, and firewood was stacked high in preparation. Trade wasn't just local. Long-distance trade, bringing luxury goods like spices, silk, or metal tools, slowed to a crawl or ceased entirely in winter. Caravans crossing vast distances, like those along the famous Silk Road or through European trade hubs, faced extreme risks from weather, bandits, and political unrest, worsened by winter's isolation. This had a ripple effect. Without fresh supplies, local markets saw shortages. Prices for staples like grain and salt could skyrocket. Some peasants had to rely on what they had stored or resort to barter for whatever remained available. Wealthier landowners or merchants sometimes hoarded goods, driving up prices and deepening hardship for poorer folk. Medieval fairs, a vital part of the economy where peasants, artisans, and traders exchanged goods, largely shut down in winter or were severely limited. These fairs were important social and economic hubs, so their absence meant fewer opportunities to buy, sell, or trade. Despite all these challenges, communities adapted. Local production became more crucial. Villages focused on preserving what they grew in the warmer months, and households became masters of stretching resources. Bartering within the village or between neighboring hamlets grew in importance, relying on personal trust rather than distant markets. Some towns and cities invested in infrastructure to keep trade moving year-round. Roads were maintained, bridges repaired, and inns kept open to shelter travelers and merchants brave enough to journey in winter. In colder regions, special sleds or sledges replaced carts, allowing transport over snow. Additionally, winter trade sometimes shifted to different goods. Fur, wool, and preserved foods became hot commodities. Fur traders, in particular, thrived as demand for warm clothing soared. Salt, crucial for preserving meat and fish, was another valuable winter trade good, often transported from coastal regions inland. Interestingly, winter also saw the rise of specific markets for fuel. Firewood, peat, and charcoal were lifelines during cold months, and their trade was essential. Collectors and traders specialized in gathering and selling these resources, often transporting them from forests or bogs to towns and villages. In sum, medieval winter trade and supply chains were complex, fragile, and yet incredibly vital. They depended on weather, geography, human ingenuity, and community cooperation. Failures in this system meant starvation and suffering. Success meant survival, and sometimes even prosperity against the odds. Understanding this web of trade reveals much about the daily lives and struggles of medieval peasants. It shows us how even in the harshest seasons, human connection and exchange remained a powerful force against isolation and scarcity. As the long, cold nights settled over villages, and the bitter wind whispered through the thin walls of humble homes, the medieval winter was never simply a season. It was an entire world. A world defined by struggle, adaptation, and a slow, steady rhythm of survival that wove through every breath, every meal, every thread of fabric, and every shared story. Now, after traveling through the layers of their lives together, from the foods carefully preserved and eaten, to the shelter built with what the land provided, to the clothes crafted to hold in precious heat, and the quiet courage demanded by mental and emotional survival, we arrive at a moment to sit with these thoughts, to breathe them in, and to understand what it truly meant to endure a medieval winter. It's tempting to see these winters as only hardship, cold, and deprivation. But within that cold, within those harsh, unyielding months, was a kind of quiet triumph, a testament to human ingenuity, resilience, and community that feels almost unimaginable today. We see people who, without the comforts of modern heating, supermarkets, or warm, insulated homes, relied on knowledge passed down through generations, on their connection to the land and on each other. Food was never just nourishment, it was a lifeline. Every root dug up before the frost, every bit of salted or smoked meat saved from summer hunts, every nut gathered from the forest floor was precious. Peasants learned how to preserve what they could, to stretch their resources through the leanest months, and to rely on a diverse diet that changed with the seasons. It wasn't gourmet, but it was survival, and it was done with remarkable skill and care. Shelter, meanwhile, was a fragile fortress against the relentless cold. Walls of wattle and daub, thatched roofs, and earthen floors might sound primitive now, but these homes were marvels of practicality. They incorporated every bit of natural insulation available, from animal dung to moss, and were built with the unspoken understanding that warmth was not just physical, but communal. Families and sometimes entire villages huddled together, body heat passed from one to the next, in a shared effort to stave off the creeping cold. Clothing, too, was crafted with purpose. Rough wool and layers upon layers were more than just fabric. They were protection, shields against the biting wind and biting frost. Each cloak and tunic told a story of resourcefulness, of making do with what was at hand, and the quiet dignity of people who did not have luxury, but found comfort where they could. But survival was not just a physical challenge. The mental and emotional toll of the long, dark months was profound. Isolation, fear of the unknown, and the harshness of the environment tested spirits daily. Yet, through songs, stories, and the simple act of gathering together, medieval peasants found ways to soothe their minds, to keep hope alive, and to pass time with moments of joy amid the hardship. Trade and supply routes, though often disrupted by weather, played a critical role in bridging communities and bringing goods that might otherwise be impossible to obtain during winter. These lifelines reinforced the idea that survival was never truly solitary. It depended on networks of people, on cooperation, and on shared effort. And hygiene, though vastly different from today's standards, was another important piece of the puzzle. Cleanliness was linked to health, and even in the coldest months, peasants found ways to maintain their well-being with limited resources. Whether through herbal remedies, steam baths, or careful tending of wounds and ailments, they fought quietly against the ever-present threat of illness. As you listen to these reflections, it's important to remember the sheer scale of what these people faced. Winters could stretch for months on end, a seemingly endless test of endurance and patience. Yet, through every trial, there was a slow but steady heartbeat of life, of adaptation, of finding joy in small comforts, and of leaning on one another to get through the darkest, coldest nights. This deep dive into medieval winter survival is more than just history. It's a meditation on human resilience, on how people can endure with grace even in the toughest of conditions. It's a reminder that the comforts we enjoy today are the fruits of centuries of struggle, innovation, and determination. So, as you lay back, let your thoughts drift with the cold winds of the past, and let the story of medieval peasants remind you of the quiet strength we all carry, the strength to face hard times, to find warmth in unexpected places, and to keep moving forward, no matter the season. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. Rest easy, and I'll see you next time.